Welcome to Lecture 5, Segment 1. In this segment, we'll make the transition from expanded ways of expressing modality, so explicit orientation, which use the resources of the ideational lexicogrammar, and then move into the experiential grammar of the clause as a figure, the system of transitivity. So in terms of this highly schematic representation of the function rank matrix as a map of the lexicogrammar of English, we now moving into from the red column to the blue column at clause rank. And we'll say something about the extension of the resources within the intersection of experiential and clause, the system of transitivity, and extension from grammar towards lexis. But let me begin by giving a recap of modal assessment. So modal assessment is a system available in the interpersonal clause grammar for assessing the exchange of propositions, proposals. Here you have a table that summarizes implicit and explicit orientation for assessment that is expressed through the mood element, the two types of modality, modalization, modulation, and other forms of assessment closely related to the mood element and to finiteness, temporality and intensity. And then forms of assessment that structurally fall outside the mood plus residue structure, different forms of comments on the exchange of goods and services and information. And these are realized as command adjuncts. Command adjuncts, as we've already seen, lie outside the mood plus residue structure. Then in the columns under orientation implicit and orientation explicit, you have the different ways in which these assessments may be realized. As finite, that's in the case only of modals, modal operators and modal auxiliaries. As mood adjunct, modal adverbs, either adverbs of modality or of temporality intensity. And then command adverbs as command adjuncts that lay outside the mood element and also the residue. So these are the adjuncts that serve to realize different assessments in terms of comments on the proposition or on the speech function. And then finally, within the residue, as predicator, either a passive verb form, like he is allowed to leave, or a form with a adjective, like he's likely to be busy, or within comment, he's foolish to be late. Then you have the explicit orientations, either explicitly subjective or explicitly objective. And they always involve the addition of one more clause. And that's a clause, in a sense, where the assessment is made explicit. Either a mental clause, I suppose he's busy, or a relational clause, it is possible that he's busy. And you find them at various points in the system of modality, but also, in fact, within assessment of the common type. So we can make the important generalization that the explicit orientation is made possible and achieved by adding another clause, one which either projects the clause as a dependent one, as in, I suppose, projected he's busy, or downranks it as an embedded one, it is probable, and then downranked, that he's busy. It is in this sense that the explicit orientation, the two forms of explicit orientation, co-opt aspects of the ideational lexicogrammar to expand the expressive resources of the interpersonal lexicogrammar, more specifically, the resources for making the orientation subjective, objective, explicit. So, if the proposition is He's busy. It can be assessed explicitly in either of two ways. Subjectively, by mental clause, I suppose he's busy. So I suppose sets up he's busy as an idea that is created through cognition, but at the same time it's assessed as median probability. Or objectively by a relational clause. It's probable, and then what's being assessed is embedded as a clause, the carrier of the attribute probable. So that's the embedded clause. He's busy. So these are two ways in which the assessment of the orientation of the assessment can be made explicit. By mental clause, subjective orientation explicit, or a relational clause, objective orientation explicit. And note, interestingly, that the mood tags reveal the difference between these two constructions. So you'd say, I suppose he's busy, isn't he? Not, I suppose he's busy, don't I? But she supposes he's busy, doesn't she? Because she supposes is not an assessment of the probability, whereas I suppose is. In contrast with the explicit objective orientation, you'd say it's probable he's busy, isn't it? So here is still the clause concerned with the attribution of the probability in this case, more generally the modalization, that is treated as a proposition in its own right, one that can be negotiated. It's probably that she's busy, it's probable that he's busy, isn't it? Yes, it is. No, it isn't. Well, it could be. It might be. So they behave somewhat differently with respect to the question tag. And that suggests that the subjective mental clause is, as it were, gone further along the line of being reanalyzed as an expression of modality. Now, interestingly, this actually extends beyond assessments having to do with modality to comment assessments. So you have the two orientations made explicit in the same way. I'm surprised that he's late. It is surprising that he's late. So the same two explicit forms of assessment, subjective and objective, are available for some of the comment adjuncts. So for example, just to take the subjective. Subjective by verbal clause, I'm telling you frankly, or I admit to you. And then what is it that I'm telling you frankly or admit? It's a proposition being assessed. He's busy. So in this case, verbal clauses are also drawn in to extend the expressive resources of the interpersonal system of assessment. And that's why in many ways it makes sense to take modality as a model for other forms of assessment. Modality is the most highly elaborated, also most highly grammaticalized of the different forms of assessment in English. That may vary from one language to another. I think I've already mentioned in passing that in some languages, the most highly grammatical form of assessment is evidentiality. So in other words, if you have modality, going back to modality, explicit orientation, there are two forms. Your name may be Smith, that's implicit, and making it explicit requires another clause. I suppose your name is Smith. So again, these explicit orientations involve modal adjectives in relational clauses. It is possible that, it is probable that, it is certain that. And in case of the subjective orientation, cognitive verbs, I suppose, I think, I reckon, I believe, I know, and so on. So you can set up, say for example, for probability, the different degrees, certain, probable, possible, the implicit, your name must be Smith, your name will be Smith, your name may be Smith, alongside explicit. I know your name is Smith, or I'm sure your name is Smith. I think your name is Smith. I suppose your name is Smith. Again, in the case of the explicit subjective orientation, what you tag is a proposition whose probability is being assessed by the mental cognitive clause. So here you have two clauses with the explicit subjective orientation. And the same is true when you have explicitly objective orientation, except that the clause that expresses the assessment is here a relational clause, typically with an adjective as attribute. So this is a general feature of the interpersonal in English and other languages, that it expands its expressive resources by borrowing or co-opting strategies from the ideational lexicogrammar. But let's take this then as a point of rounding off the discussion for the interpersonal for now. We have, by examining these subjective, explicitly subjective and objective expressions of assessment, noted two types of transitivity, more specifically process type, mental clauses and relational clauses. And that's in a sense a preview of coming attractions. So we'll now move into transitivity and we'll see where these two clause types are located in the overall set of resources of transitivity. But let me just take a step back, a bit of a recap, coming back to the metafunctional spectrum of meanings, the metafunctions. So we're saying if you hold up a theoretical prism to meaning in text, we will find that there are different ranges, not just white light, but red interpersonal meaning, yellow textual meaning, green logical meaning, and blue experiential meaning. And as we saw at the beginning of the semester, any clause we take will be analyzed, teasing apart, as it were, these different strands of meaning running through the clause. So the textual strand where we started, theme plus reme, that's treating the clause as a message. Okay? That was our first point of attention. Then we moved our attention to the clause as a move. And now we're moving our attention to the clause as a figure. A figure is a configuration of a process up to three participants, in the case of the example, one existent, and zero or more circumstances, like the circumstance of place here. So in this example, in Italy, there were many independent cities in which lived a large middle class as well as a large professional class of lawyers, doctors, and clergymen. This, you see, is deconstructed, analyzed according to the three metafunctional strands. And the different strands are functionally organized, but may, as it were, organize the text in different ways. Not just the text, the clause, as a message, as a move, as a figure. So we now move into the view of the clause as a figure, looking at the experiential grammar of the clause. So in the clause as a figure, our construal of experience of the flow events. What's the resource? The system of transitivity. If we look at that in terms of our function rank matrix, it's the blue column at the top row of clause. So again, we started with the yellow column. We started looking at the clause as a message, paying particular attention to theme, also mentioning voice, and paying attention to conjunction. It's certainly as far as conjunctions become textual themes. And then we moved on to the interpersonal. Here, the key system is mood, and we looked at related systems of polarity, modality, other forms of assessment, vocatives, and so on. And now then, we're moving in on the key system of the clause as a figure, transitivity. So the system of transitivity is a central system of the clause as a, not a move, no, wrong Christian, as a figure. It realizes a semantic system of figuration. Give you a bit of a sense abstractly of this. We say that the clause from an experiential point of view represents a quantum of change in the flow of events. So let me just figuratively represent the flow of events like this. So we experience the flow of events. We attend to it in different ways, visually through our other sensory senses, but also, of course, semiotically, in terms of how we construe it, not only say visually, but also semiotically, linguistically. So if you have an ongoing flow of events, a key challenge for the system of transitivity is to help speakers and writers decide how to chunk this flow event into quanta of change. It's not at all given in the nature of things. There are different ways of quantizing, of chunking the flow events. Within one language, you may see variation, and there can be considerable variation across languages. Here, schematically, I suggested there's a sort of flow events, parts of a wave, and it's construed into two clauses, each representing a quantum of change, but they're linked into clause complex. We'll come to that towards the end of the semester, through some logical semantic relation of projection or expansion. But alternatively, they might have been construed as a single clause with a process plus 1, 2, or 3 participants augmented by circumstances. So there is considerable play in the grammar. The system of transitivity, together with the system of taxes for forming clause complexes or clause nexuses, allows to provide alternative ways of construing the flow events into quanta of change. So this wave motion, right, may invite us as an illustration to think about how is a seascape represented? How would you represent this linguistically? What would be quantum of change, for example, in representing waves thundering in, hitting the shore of the beach? Here is, of course, a representation in a painting by Martin Amond. And you could say that the painting represents, well, what does it represent? I'd leave that to you to think about. Does it represent a figure or several figures, a sequence of figures, or an episode? It's interesting to think about. And if there is time, I will draw an analogy using the work by Michael O'Toole, who's turned the model that was originally developed by Halliday for interpreting and theorizing language and describing languages with meta-functions, ranks, and so on. So Michael O'Toole turned this to paintings and also sculptures and architecture. So we could ask this about our experience of the swell of waves hitting the shore, here construed pictorially as a painting. What would be the linguistic analog? How would we verbalize, or how would we verbalize this painting? It's an interesting question. Now, we might expect to get some hints. So, for example, we could ask, how will surfers construe other surfers caught in massive waves? Okay. Can they give us any hint as to how we will construe our experience of this ebb and flow of massive waves? Well, let's have a listen and a view.
Where is he?
Oh fucking god! Oh my god!
Well, I'm not sure that the experiment worked. What's the answer? Well, they wouldn't at the time they're watching their poor friends being tumbled around by the waves. Okay, they'd resort to exclamations. In other words, essentially, they would use a proto-linguistic residue in language, exclamations, not for construing the experience of their friends being tumbled around by the waves, but simply for reacting. So what you found were minor clauses of the type explanation, oh my God, and this kind of thing. So there is a time when construal may take too long, or when the immediate reaction is not experiential one, but one that is more proto-linguistic, as it were, as I put it, exclamations in reaction to the experience. So we'll have to find some other way of looking at how people construe their experience of different events. Let's have a look at how this is done in comics. It may be helpful. And then I coming around to other examples, like film, for example, or how people explain collisions, car collisions, and so on, construe them. Okay, so construing experience in comics, and we can ask, taking any comic, how experience is represented pictorially and linguistically. And again, I resort to my typical artist, Hergé, and his comic book creation, Tintin and Friends, Captain Haddock, and so on. Now, what strikes you first, if you think about this purely from the point of view of construing experience, is, of course, it's chunked. But the main chunking is, as it were, pictorial rather than linguistic. So the linguistic chunking occurs within the pictorial chunking. What's the pictorial chunking? Well, panels. So the story that is being told here is told panel by panel. And I've just moved in medias res, in the middle of things. So it's not the beginning of the story. You will see that some of the panels are purely pictorial, like the middle one, row 2, okay, or the first two ones in row 3. Okay, there may be some imitation of sound, but this is not actually somebody thinking or saying something, like clang and tak-a-tak, katak. Then other panels, right, they include the pictorial representation, but also linguistic representation. How is a linguistic representation, how does it come in? Well, in partitions. So in partitions that are not actually truly part of the experience being represented, but as it were set off as separate. And these are ones where people talk or think. So let's have a look at this. The middle panel, that's simply, it represents doing and happening pictorially, moving in this case, and we can see the typical conventions for showing an object that's moving. So we can infer a vector of the direction of motion. So moving and happening, doing and happening, a particular case of moving. Or another case here, doing and happening, moving. Here is Tintin walking, rather a car approaching Moulinsart, the Captain Haddock's mansion. Now, notice that we can have more than one kind of change within one and the same panel, because this shows that Tintin is moving, he's walking, but at the same time something else is happening. And similarly in the first one, we can see that Captain Haddock is driving, and while he's driving, they're saying things. And this is how the experience of saying is represented. So the sayers, people speaking, and then what they say, their locutions, their speech, is set off in partitions, as I call them, speech balloons. So the sayers in the process of saying are represented pictorially, but what they say is difficult to represent pictorially, so that's represented linguistically. By tomorrow evening, I should probably have it all sewn up. Oh? And the second kind of experience that has to resort to language as well as picture is the experience of sensing. So here Tintin thinks, God, good. I was still with the surface, sorry. Good. Now I must be on my guard. What is that? Well, there's a representation of not something Tintin says, but something he thinks. And that's represented not as a speech balloon, still as a partition, but as what we might call a thought cloud. So we have these different kinds of experiences sorted out by the conventions of the comic strip. And similarly, you continue down, you see there are panels, as I said before, there are purely ones of doing and happening. The only place where something linguistic might come in is as a sound effect, as it were. But it's not treated as something that's created through saying or sensing. So with this initial brush with comic strips, it would appear that there are at least 3 different domains of experience. There is a kind of first order of doing and happening experience that can be represented purely pictorially. So this experience, apart from, as I said, expressions of different sounds like clang, can be drawn, can be painted, can be depicted without the help of language. But then there are 2 other kinds of experience, 2 other domains of experience, saying and sensing. And these, it would appear, require language. So while the first can be monomodal in the system, sense of modal systems, the second 2 have to be bimodal. There is a first order of experience that can be depicted, drawn, painted, and then there's a higher order of experience that is only representable linguistically, what people say and what they think, their locutions and their ideas. Now that's an interesting thing you get out of examining comic strips, the sort of sense of different domains of experience being sorted out according to the conventions of comic strips, at least these 3. Okay, there are in fact more, but these 3 are very central. Something else we learn from comic strips, and it's this, right? That in representing, saying, doing and happening and sensing, pictorially, so depicting them, drawing them, what we have is in fact one object, an entity, maybe a person, maybe a car, depends, and that object, that entity, represents both a participant and a process that the participant is involved in. So if you look at Tintin here, the depiction of Tintin represents both him as a sayer and as a process of saying. And we see this if we try to, as we translate that into English, it would be something like Tintin said, "By tomorrow evening I shall." In English then, the sayer and the saying are diffused, not fused, but diffused, as it were. They separated out into a process, said, and a participant, Tintin. And similarly with sensing, we'd say Tintin thought, "Good, now I must be on my guard." So this is represented as one person, okay, sensing, sensor, one person in the drawing, okay, but separated out when it's construed linguistically in English, for example. Tintin thought, blah, blah, blah. And again, similarly with doing and happening. Now, the fusion is with the car. It is both a doer, as it were, or mover, and it also implies or represents the process of moving, a process of doing and happening. If we translate that into English, it would be something like the car was approaching Murinzar, with a separation of the participant, the car, and the process was approaching. So that's quite interesting when we compare the depiction, the pictorial representation of experience, and the linguistic representation of experience. And what we see here in English is characteristic of language in general. One exception, we'll come to this, in a language like English would be a clause like "it's snowing," where in fact "it" is not a participant, you can see this, you can't query it, you can't say what's snowing or the clouds. That's just playing with language. So there are some clause types in English that consist of process only, but on the whole, you have separated out process plus at least one participant. So, in the clause, process and participant are separated out, not fused in one. So that's an initial illustration of transitivity, looking across to this bimodal semiotic, as it were, of comic strips. So we've already learned something about transitivity by glancing at comic strips. We've learned about different domains of experience, and we learned about the fundamental model of the clause teasing apart at least one participant from the process. So systematically, we'll now be exploring the system of transitivity, the clause as a figure or configuration of process, participants, attendant circumstances. In your material, this is chapter 4 in the textbook, Deploying Functional Grammar, and it consists of the usual subsections. So read orientation first, just to warm up to deal with the rest of the description of transitivity. If you need more detailed references, it's chapter 5 in the Halliday's Introduction to Functional Grammar. And note that's in something you have in your shared folder, you have the Dictionary of Grammatical and Lexical Items, and a very long section 1.1 is devoted to verbs. So often when you do transitivity analysis, you'll come across very frequent verbs like do, make, for example, and you can look them up in this dictionary to get some suggestion as to what are the possible process types in which these may function. So have a look at these materials. Now, so we've already seen that a quantum of change is construed as a number of elements. It's treated as an organic whole, and that organic whole is deconstructed into 3 different kinds of roles. The process, that represents change through time, is arriving, will have been going to experiment. Participants involved in this change, bringing it about or affecting it, and participants compared with the process are relatively more permanent. I mean, they may be affected, they may even be brought into existence by the performance of the process, but they're not, unlike the process, simply located in time, past, present, future, in language like English. And then indirect participants, as it were, circumstances attendant on the process and process participant, indirectly involved. So this is a kind of model where it looks like the process is a center, and then other elements are more or less centrally or peripherally involved in this process. So just to help us think about it, we can use the analogy of our solar system. Treating the sun, imagining the sun as a process, and then planets that circulate fairly close to the process and are affected by it, are affected by it in different ways, as participants. And then when you move further away, you get more to the periphery, you get to circumstances. So there is a sense in which the clause has a nucleus of process plus participants, some in fact being more directly involved in the process than others, one in particular, the medium. We'll meet that later. And that nucleus or expanded nucleus is the basis for the system of process type. So process type, the system of process type, determines not only the nature of the process, but also the number of nature participants. And we've already, in fact, seen the semantic analogues of 3 process types: doing and happening, sensing and saying. And that's what we'll be exploring when we go further into the system of process type, the different domains of experience. One of the major subsystems of the system of transitivity, process type. And again, process type is, as it were, the closed grammar theory of how experience can be sorted out into different domains, like the inner experience of sensing, or the experience of actions, activities, of doing and happening. But that's where we'll pick up next time. Thank you.